I'd like to speak a little bit about the weaponry that your ancestors would have carried into battle. Now, you know that. All right, is that a little bit better? Okay. Well, again, so I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about some of the weaponry that your ancestors would have carried into battle. Now, there's no denying that they would have certainly carried some northern firearms with them, and they would have certainly carried some British firearms with them as well. But they also had their own. There were Confederate factories cranking out firearms. So at the very beginning of the war in April of '61, just as they were scrambling to put together a government, they were also scrambling to come up with enough arms for their men. They began with a number of companies making pikes, but they realized they're going to need firearms as well. Jefferson Davis, in February of '61, he mentions that those who oppose the South will feel Southern steel, but there was a shortage of that material. As I mentioned, some of them ended up carrying United States weapons that had been repurposed, and some carrying British pieces. But what it came down to is that the Confederacy wanted their own weaponry. But unfortunately, they did not have the time or the resources to invent their own designs. So it becomes a concept of, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And so they copied Union designs, and that's what we end up with. So for starters, we have Griswold and Gunnison is one of the manufacturers that we'll discuss today. Before the Civil War, Samuel Griswold, he was a very successful businessman. He had 4,000 acres in Macon, Georgia, and he even named a town after himself, Griswoldville. Having a little bit of difficulty with this little mouse. Oh yeah. Okay. So then his partner, Arvin Gunnison, he had been an employee with Mr. Griswold for a number of years, but then he became the person in charge of the factory. Mr. Griswold was the brains behind the operation, and Mr. Gunnison was the everyday guy getting things done for him in the factory. So with Southern weaponry in short supply, February of '62, Georgia Governor Brown calls for making pikes. So they answer the call and they begin making a great number of pikes to issue to the Confederate soldiers. Now it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that a firearm is certainly a lot more effective than a pike. And so they branch out. They see a new market available to them. So they start creating revolvers. Their production numbers were at the top of all of the Confederate makers. But unfortunately, production ends abruptly in November of 1864. Captain Frederick Land, with the 9th Michigan Volunteer Cavalry, came down to Griswoldville and burnt the town down. That began Sherman's march to the sea. Griswoldville never recovered. You can go down there today, and all you will see is a historic marker at a crossroads. So examples of their firearms, they're spotted by their brass frames, a slight upward angle to the butt profile, twist lines on the cylinder caused by its manufacture from twisted iron instead of steel, and they made about 3,700 of these firearms during '62 to '64. They were .36 caliber based on the Colt Navy 1851 revolver with a barrel assembly that looked like the slightly earlier Colt Dragoon model. Next up, Spiller and Burr, and this company has some Virginia ties before they head further down south. Their factory ends up in Atlanta, Georgia. This is a very recent Google Earth shot. The factory occupied the red circle here, and it was in very close proximity to the Georgia Capitol building right over here. So once they moved from Virginia down to Georgia, they had a very prime location with the Georgia state government. So as I said, they originally had a Virginia connection. It was originally located in Richmond, and it was a combination from Edward Spiller and David Burr, along with firearms expert James Burton. Burr was a Southern sympathizer in Baltimore, Maryland. Spiller was raised in Richmond, and he specialized in a factory that created steam engines and locomotives. So they've certainly got the brain power and the mechanical know-how, but they need someone who knows firearms. And that's where James Burton comes into play. Burton had worked at the Harper's Ferry Arsenal, making firearms there. He also worked at the Hall's Rifle Works, which was a company located just to the side of the Harper's Ferry Arsenal in the same complex there. He worked for the Ames Manufacturing Company that was known for making swords and sabers. And he even went over to the Royal Small Arms Manufactory in England. So if you want a guy who knows how to make firearms on your side, James Burton was certainly the man to do it. And so they were very glad to have him with them. He ends up as a lieutenant colonel in the Confederate Army, and he held the role of superintendent of armories for the Bureau of Ordnance. He was a very powerful man indeed. So in 1862, they moved down to Atlanta, Georgia. The reason is because Burton had been directed by his superiors in the Confederate Army and the Bureau of Ordnance to set up a factory near Atlanta. Land was too expensive in Atlanta, so they ended up on a site in Macon because the city gave them the land for free. Hard to pass up that cost. After they settled in Macon in '62, they began production for 3 years. They only made about 1,500 firearms, which was only 10% of the incredibly optimistic goal of 15,000 that Mr. Burton had negotiated for with the Confederate government. So they tried, but this is going to be a recurring theme. They tried, but they often fall short in the manufacturing numbers. When it came to the design of the gun, the Confederate contract through the government specified that it should be based on Colonel Colt's design. Very popular design, and again, if it's not broke, don't fix it. No sense in reinventing the wheel. But Burton decided that he knew a little bit better than those in Richmond, and so he decided to create a gun based on the Whitney Navy revolver. It was more reliable, it was easier to manufacture, and it had a solid frame, which made it more durable than Colonel Colt's guns. So despite the frame being made from brass, because of a shortage of steel in the South, they were supposed to be electroplated in silver to give them a look of having been made from steel, and to give them a closer appearance to the Whitney Navy. But the idea ends up being scrapped fairly quickly. It's a costly procedure, and it's a time-consuming procedure. And Southern soldiers certainly need these firearms, so there's no sense in wasting that time on an aesthetic appearance when they need to get these guns in the hands of the Southern boys. Like the Griswold and Gunnison, their cylinder is made out of twisted iron. What this does is it takes the bar iron and they put a slight twist in it so that the lines in the iron are not directly aligned with the chambers in the cylinder. It makes it stronger and prevents the gun from being more likely to have an accidental discharge and explode and hurt the individual operating the firearm. Then we come to J.H. Danson Brothers. We'll move from Georgia over to Texas. The Dance factory is located on the Brazos River. The Dance family home still stands today, and the shop was located directly across the street from the house, right on the river, prime location. These are some of the most distinctive guns that the South makes. They're copies of the Colt Dragoon, but they differ slightly in appearance. There is no recoil shield on the back of these firearms. I'll move back to a photograph of one and show you what I mean by a lack of a recoil shield. You see the frame is flat right here. There would normally be a half circle piece that projects out there and protects the rear of the cylinder, but not so on the Dance revolvers. Makes them very distinctive looking, and also one of the easiest guns to counterfeit, because you can take a Colt revolver and grind off the recoil shield, and there were many fakes that floated around. They made them in 36 and 44 caliber, both of which lacked the recoil shield. The company was started by James Henry Dance and his brothers. They were descended from a color bearer who served with General Washington. So a lot of prestige in the family. Not long before the war, James left home in Alabama and headed to Texas. His brothers followed him along with his sisters, and they set up shop on 900 acres and opened a large-scale blacksmith shop. So even before the war, they were doing quite well for themselves. Production begins in 1862 in East Columbia, Texas, at the request of Governor Logan. He got a letter signed by 26 prominent members in the city, and because the guns were in so high demand, he exempted the workers in the factory from service in the Army. He felt that it was far more important for them to be in the factory cranking out weaponry to be used against the northern invaders than to actually be in the field fighting. Many contemporaries believed that it was an absolute superior design. In September of '62, the Houston Tri-Weekly Telegraph calls the guns, quote, superior to Colt's best. That's pretty high praise for these Southern boys. Very nice to hear that they can rival what Sam Colt is making up in the East. By 1863, the Union forces have become aware of the factory in East Columbia, Texas, and it quickly became a target. The company decided to relocate a few miles to avoid shelling. So they ended up on the Brazos River in the photograph that I showed you there. And they had hoped to pick up where they left off and continue manufacture of the firearms. But for one reason or another, the production never resumed. They did indeed build a factory there, but it didn't get used for revolvers. The buildings stood until the early 1900s, and then they had a hurricane come through and it took them down. But a gentleman owns the home and the land across the street to the factory. He has done some archaeological work there, and they have found a great number of pieces of the guns that were there. So that's proof that they really were intent on starting up production again, but things went awry and the buildings just didn't get used to their full extent. We don't know exactly how many Dance revolvers were made. Estimates are only between 325 and 500, so that's a fairly limited run for these pieces. Most were in 44 caliber, some were made in the smaller 36 caliber. And again, as I mentioned, if you have the opportunity to examine one of these pieces, use extreme caution because there were a lot of fakes and forgeries created by messing up some of Colonel Colt's guns and grinding off the recoil shields. They certainly command a premium, and you wouldn't want to get duped. Next up is a man by the name of Thomas W. Coffer. Again, we come back to the Old Dominion. Mr. Coffer was in Portsmouth, Virginia, and he has some of the rarest examples of firearms. His were based on the Whitney Navy, and his estimates are very small. Only between 86 and 140 of the guns were made. Less than 10 are known to exist today. The biggest visual differentiation between the Whitney and the Coffer is that Coffer's gun features a spur trigger, which does not have your standard trigger guard. It's just a little protrusion from the bottom of the frame. Coffer was no stranger to gunsmithing when the war broke out. It was a very easy transition for him to begin making revolvers because he had been a firearms apprentice to his cousin, a man by the name of Pembroke Walpy. Sometime before '61, Coffer went into business for himself and started making some shotguns bearing his name on the lock plates in the few years before the war. Government order for 82 revolvers was completed and delivered by Coffer in May of '62. This was the only contract that he received from the Confederate government, and all 82 of those firearms were issued and delivered to the 5th Virginia Cavalry. By January of '64, his property in Portsmouth had been seized by the Marshal of the United States and was sold at auction to Samuel Freedley of Philadelphia. Coffer relocated to Richmond and worked at the arsenal there until 1865, and then after the war, he returned to Portsmouth and was able to buy his home back and continued work as a gunsmith until he passed away in July of 1875 at only 57 years old. Now, Mr. Coffer is a very interesting individual, despite there being little known about him. He actually holds the first patent issued by the Confederate States government. And believe it or not, a friend of mine actually owns the original patent documents and one of the only surviving Coffer guns. So all of the material and documentary evidence about his first patent in the Confederate government does survive. And there's an antique arms show held in Baltimore, Maryland in March of every year by the Maryland Arms Collectors Association. And my friend exhibited his Coffer piece this year, and it actually won Best in Show. So very, very wonderful gun, and really nice to know that it's being very well cared for. Next up, we have Columbus Firearms Manufacturing Company. Set up in Columbus, Georgia, they had really big plans that never really got off the ground. August 26, 1862, brothers Lewis and Elias Hayman were awarded a contract from the Confederate government for 10,000 revolvers. Based on the Colt 51 Navy, the brothers had been successful. They had an iron works with a foundry, machine shop, blacksmith shop with 30 forges, a large saddlery shop, and a 30 horsepower engine. These gentlemen had done very well for themselves before the war. So it was only natural that they can transition very easily into making firearms. So they had gotten $50,000, no small sum at that time in 1862, from the Confederate government as a prepayment to make some of their guns. And so they were very confident. A week before the contract was awarded, they took out an ad in the local paper that they were looking for 25 machinists, promising, quote, good wages and steady employment. That shows how confident they were. They convinced the government to pay them up front, and they put out an ad to hire a bunch of workmen even before the contract gets awarded. But unfortunately, they're putting the cart ahead of the horse a little bit here. March of '63, they ran another ad in 13 papers for 100 additional machinists and gunsmiths. In May of '63, the Montgomery Weekly Advertiser called the Columbus revolvers, quote, equal in every respect to the celebrated Colt pistols. Again, very high praise. But unfortunately, very little is known about these firearms beyond what I just told you. Things go very wrong at the factory very quickly. Estimates put that no more than 100 of them were made. Highest serial number on a gun that we have seen to date is only 94. Letters between the officers in 1864 indicate that the company, now valued at $80,000, so they've done quite well for themselves in bringing things forward, have been actually purchased from the Hayman brothers by the Confederate government to set up an arsenal there. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, they had put the cart before the horse. They did not have the raw materials that they needed to produce the revolvers. So unfortunately, production really never took off under Confederate government control, and only a small batch of them are known to have been made up until production ceased in late March of '65, just a couple short weeks before Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Next up, we have a company by the name of Augusta Machine Works. Facility is located in Augusta, Georgia, based on the 1851 Navy revolver. They made only 100 or so of them in a 3-year time span between 1861 and 1864. There were 2 varieties made. One had 6 cylinder stops on the cylinder and one had 12. They both had one-piece wooden grips and a brown finish on all of the metal, except for the brass grip straps, giving them a very distinctive look. The guns with the 12 stops are more rare than the 6, and serial numbers are very well marked on the pieces that exist, and it is unusual in that both letters and numbers were used in their serial numbers. So some are 2 digits, one is number 13, some have a serial number of U, which makes no sense that they used the letter U and the number 13 on their pieces. We may never know exactly why they used such an unusual method for their numbering. If you're trying to identify an Atlanta Machine Works revolver, you'll notice in the barrel there is a very faint 6-groove rifling with a right-hand twist, and the cylinders measure 1 11/16 in length, and frames that measure 3 3/16 in length. Now, this may seem like splitting hairs, measuring something so very precisely, but again, because these are Confederate copies of Northern guns, many people try to fake pieces. These are incredibly hard to come by, and one of the only ways to know and to delineate between a Confederate piece and a Colt piece is to break out a tape measure and to measure the length of the cylinder and the frames. It's that precise in order to be able to figure out if it was a copy or a genuine gun. Again, something very important if you're going to spend 5 or even 6 figures on one of these incredibly rare guns. Next up is a company by the name of Leach and Rigdon, and there's a couple variations in the company with these guns. Thomas Leach was a very successful cotton broker in Memphis before the war. August 29th of '61, he takes out an ad in the Memphis Appeal looking for 10,000 pounds of zinc, copper, and brass for military purposes. Less than 3 weeks later, he sends out another ad saying that he's taking orders for swords, sabers, cutlasses, knives, bayonets, bullet molds, and much more. Leach is very ambitious in his production goals. May of '62, he teams up with Charles Rigdon, an unusual pairing because Mr. Rigdon made pharmacy scales. Not exactly something you would think of when you want someone to help you with your arms design. They open up a company called Memphis Novelty Works. They take out an ad in the Memphis Appeal, and it notes that their swords are being made in Columbus, Mississippi. Now this is unusual because they took out an ad in the Memphis paper talking about items being made down in Mississippi. It appears that there was a little bit of overlap and the company ends up relocating down to Columbus. Once they get down there, they drop the name Memphis and they simply become the Novelty Works. At this point, they branch out. They're doing good business, creating swords and sabers and bullet molds and things of that nature. But again, there's a shortage of revolvers, so anyone looking to get in on this is welcome to do so. When Sherman makes his way south, Leach and Rigdon move further south as well. They head over to Greensboro, Georgia, and they purchase the former Greensboro Steam Factory, and they retrofitted that factory and turned it into a gunsmith shop. They received a contract from the Confederate government March 6th of 1863, and they were to make copies of the the Colt Model 1851 Navy, but only for a few months. Their partnership goes south and they dissolve on December 13th of 1863. But we're going to be coming back. Rigdon finds new partners. He reforms and the name of the company changes from Leach and Rigdon to Rigdon, Ansley and Company. Like I said, he wasted no time. Their partnership initially dissolved December 13th of 1863. About 6 weeks later, January 27th of 1864, the Augusta Chronicle and Sentinel announces the formation of Rigdon, Ansley and Company. The other principals are Jesse Ansley, Andrew Smith, and Charles Keene. This was a continuation of the contract that had been procured by the previous partnership. Rigdon took all of the machinery with him, and they opened up the Georgia Iron Works. We don't know exactly what went south between Leach and Rigdon, but apparently it would appear that Mr. Rigdon came out on top since he got to keep all of the machinery. Serial numbers on the frames indicate that they simply finished out the contract that had been established in the previous partnership. Only a total of 1,500 revolvers. Main distinction between the partnerships, just the name. If they're finishing out the contract, the guns are going to look the same. Both production variations feature one-piece walnut grips, blued barrels and cylinders, case-hardened frames, and brass guards and back straps. To sum things up here, we have to look at the impact of Southern steel. The Confederacy had a very big dream, as we all know, and one small component of that dream was to be able to produce firearms at the same rate as was being done in the northern factories. Unfortunately, this just wasn't meant to be. We cannot dismiss the large impact that was had by the comparatively small number of Southern revolvers. They certainly functioned just as well, and I know of no indications and records that say a Southern soldier would have thrown away one of his Southern guns, Southern revolvers anyway, for a Northern counterpart piece. Even though Davis's Southern steel was in reality brass and iron, it was still a powerful statement that the Southern soldiers brought to fruition, as evidenced by the death toll on the field of battle. A firearm is a firearm, and they kill all just the same. So with that, I greatly appreciate you allowing me to talk about these Confederate copycat killers for a little bit of time with you today. I cut my presentation a little short. I know you guys are running tight on time, but I wanted to leave a little bit of time if there are any questions. So thank you very much, and if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer. Yes, ma'am. The Lamat was a French design, and it was actually a partnership with Pierre-Gustave Toutant-Beauregard down in New Orleans, and they made the guns in Paris, France. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
The one that you said your friend has, where did he get it? Do you know where it was found, or?
Yeah, he purchased it at auction. I don't know where it had been located before then, but he purchased it from a well-known auction house that deals in firearms, and all the documentation was there. It's been examined. It is the real deal, but I don't know where it came from before it ended up at the auction house. Yes, ma'am.
Did Coffer have anything to do with importing shotguns?
Coffer did make shotguns, and he's got some that were produced before the Civil War that bear his name on them. Whether or not they are guns that he made himself or pieces that he imported and put his name on them, it's certainly possible. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry? Approximately 6 inches or so. Yes, ma'am.
If someone just happened to have an old pistol, where would you take it to find out the history?
You can take it to me. I'd be more than happy to look at it. I've got my contact information on the last slide here. There's also a brochure in each one of your bags that has my physical location at the museum in Fairfax, Virginia. So would certainly welcome any of you. You can call me or email me, and we can set up a time to get together, and I'd be more than happy to look at these. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, the question was, did a majority of the pieces come from England since we were having trouble creating them in the South? The answer is yes and no. We certainly had a very good trading relationship with England. A lot of pieces came over from England, but the guys were also using a wide variety of northern pieces. They certainly used Colt revolvers and Remington revolvers. They took whatever they could get their hands on. There's a remarkable book called The English Connection, and it deals all about all of the different types of materials, including fabric and so forth, that was brought over to the Confederacy from the British. The English Connection is the name of that book. Very informative piece. I'd recommend looking it up if you have an interest in the British involvement in the Confederacy. Yes, ma'am.
With the diversity of firearms, how big a problem was supplying ammunition?
Ammunition wasn't too big of a problem because what they all fired was very similar, especially in the revolvers. You're dealing with black powder cap and ball guns, percussion ignition systems in 36 and 44 caliber. So any of the handheld bullet molds that you can get your hands on are going to be able to make the round balls and some of the conical miniature pistol rounds. No issues with interchangeability on that, as long as you have the right caliber.
I just want to say on Logan's behalf, if you have a chance to get to the NRA Museum, allow yourself at least 3 hours. It is a fantastic firearms exhibit, and it is a wonderful place to go, and especially take friends and whatever. So I'm going to give him a plug, because that is a wonderful place there.
I appreciate the kind words, and we do have a Civil War section. It's divided in half. We've got a Union side on one side of the hall and a Confederate parlor on the other side of the hall. And there are two pieces in the collection that, to me, bookend the war very nicely. One of the pieces we have is one of the 75 Sharps carbines that John Brown used at his unsuccessful raid at Harper's Ferry Arsenal in October of 1859. We know it was with him because after he was captured, the guns were confiscated and the serial numbers were recorded into the congressional record. So we know without a shadow of a doubt that that gun was there. And to me, that lights the long fuse that ignites the powder keg that becomes the Civil War in April of '61 at Fort Sumter. Then across on the Confederate side, we have a London Armory Kerr revolver. It's a 44 caliber percussion gun, double action, very innovative for the day. And this piece was in the possession of Jefferson Davis just days before he was captured. He's running south, trying to stay ahead of the Union cavalry, and the head of his security detail is a man by the name of Colonel Gibbon Campbell. And on May 4th of 1865, he gives that gun to Campbell and tells him, thank you for your service, but it's every man for himself at this point, and disbands them. Campbell kept an amazing diary and wrote down, on this day, President Davis gave me this firearm and this was the serial number. And then later on, he actually engraved that information onto the gun. And the provenance record is still intact with his diary. It came up for auction in 2014, but a very generous friend of the museum purchased the piece with the sole purpose of putting it on loan. So in a space of about 20 feet, you can sum up the entirety of the Civil War, starting with the John Brown Sharps and ending with Confederate President Davis's London Armory Kerr revolver. So very, very neat. Any other questions? All right, well again, I thank you so very much for allowing me to spend some time with you today. It's been a pleasure.